The spring selling season is well underway, notably in our two biggest cities, and there are increasing signs that markets there are picking up and recovering after 18 months or so of correction after the big booms in Sydney and Melbourne. And in honour of that occasion, we've published this week what we're calling our spring special bundle: the best of Sydney, the best of Melbourne, top 5 Sydney hotspots and top 5 Melbourne hotspots together in one bundle, 2 reports for the price of one. Tonight I just want to talk about one location in each of the 2 major cities as an example of what's in those reports. But before I do that, let's have a look at some of the evidence that those markets are rising. We're seeing it increasingly with increased activity in those markets. Demand is definitely picking up. People on the ground are reporting quite intense competition for good properties. Good properties are relatively scarce. There's not as much on the market as there was a year ago, or certainly compared with 2 years ago. So with the market reviving and buyers active again, particularly home buyers, not so much investors this time around so far, we're seeing good prices being fetched for good property and lots of competition. Auction clearance rates have been consistently strong, if you can believe the figures. And we're starting to see growing evidence of prices picking up. Today, SQM Research, one of the best sources of good data of all sorts about real estate markets across Australia, published their weekly Asking Prices Index, and it shows that a trend that's significant, that while Sydney and Melbourne in annual terms, their prices index are still down, although not much down now than they were 12 months ago. The weekly and monthly indexes are showing significant rises. The rolling monthly index for Sydney is up 2% for the month, and Melbourne's up 1.8%. Both are still down marginally compared to 12 months ago. Sydney's down 1.1% in annual terms, and Melbourne's down 1.3%. But I think that's quite significant that the degree to which they are below the index level of a year ago is so small, because perhaps 6 months ago both were down 9 or 10% according to SQM Research. So there's been quite a rapid improvement, a big turnaround, and that's showing up in the index's short-term measures, the weekly index and the monthly index. Incidentally, we're seeing that pattern right across the major capital cities. Brisbane, its indexes weekly, monthly and annual are all up. Perth is still down a little bit in annual terms, but it's up weekly and it's up in the monthly index. Adelaide's up in all 3. Canberra, some parts of the Canberra market is up according to this measure. Hobart, still up in annual terms and in monthly terms, both for units and apartments. And Darwin is probably the only market that's still a little bit down. But tonight we're talking about the 2 biggest cities, and they're the subject of this week's publication of the spring special bundle: the best of Sydney, the best of Melbourne, 2 reports rather, for the price of one. Now, the Sydney report contains 5 locations that we think have good potential for growth going forward as Sydney moves into what appears to be a pretty solid recovery phase. And one of the locations that we feature in that report is the Northern Beaches region. We found that it was one of the most resilient markets during the recent post-boom downturn, 18 months to 2 years, in which Sydney prices came back quite a lot. But the Northern Beaches precinct, based around suburbs like Manly and Avalon Beach, stretching 30 kilometres from Manly up to Palm Beach, and lots of iconic seaside locations in this area with pretty high prices, although units are a lot more affordable, and that's a major part of the market there. But this precinct was more resilient than most to the downturn. In fact, in annual terms, some locations have actually continued to show price growth, which we'll get to in a moment. And prices in the apartment markets in particular have held up particularly well. We've got suburbs there like Frenchs Forest and Freshwater, which have continued to attract strong buyer demand. That's showing up in the sales activity figures. We often look at that as a better marker for what's going on with markets than movements in median prices, which is the thing that media is most obsessed with, but it's just one marker. I think there are others that are equally valid. And when we look at sales volumes, we get an indication of where markets are going to go in terms of prices in the future. They tend to be a precursor to movements in prices up or down. That's why we place so much attention and emphasis on sales volumes, which means demand in the market. So the Northern Beaches area are a very strong market traditionally. It's been resistant to the downturn more so than most, and it's now showing good signs of recovery as Sydney moves back in the upward direction. Infrastructure is something we always look for, and that area's got the newly opened $600 million Northern Beaches Hospital, plus $500 million being spent on roads around the hospital to improve traffic flow. We've also got the proposed Beaches Link tunnel expected to happen, which will also improve connectivity in that particular area. It's obviously a wealthy area and a high-priced one. Looking at data for typical incomes in that area, Manly, for example, median weekly income there is approximately double the New South Wales average, and that's a common factor right throughout this precinct, that incomes are much higher than average. We have very good suburbs. I mentioned Freshwater and Frenchs Forest as two very good suburbs that attract high demand. I spoke to well-known buyer's agent Rich Harvey, or property buyer, about those areas, and he said Freshwater is a high-demand suburb, village feel, family-friendly atmosphere, gorgeous beach. Properties are very highly sought after in Freshwater. Frenchs Forest benefits from the new infrastructure, including the road upgrades and the new hospital. And the new rezoning is taking place there, which could represent opportunity for investors, where they're going to be allowing higher density development of residential around the hospital. DY is the busiest market in the Northern Beaches precinct, particularly for apartments. More than half of properties in the DY suburb are apartments, and there have been, in the last 12 months, over 550 unit sales, and it's very highly favoured by renters. Nearly half of households in that suburb are renters, and it's probably why it has one of the lowest vacancy rates right across the precinct. It's currently 1.4%, which is very low. Sydney overall has a vacancy rate of about 3.5%, so well above the comfortable 3% benchmark level, but this precinct is 1.5%, and it hasn't been above 2% any time in the last 10 years. Very strong rental market, DY, and affordable by the standards of the area. Median apartment price in the mid 700,000s. Most suburbs with apartments in the Northern Beaches precinct more in the 800,000s and above for apartments, and you can imagine how expensive the houses are. All these suburbs have median prices above $1 million, including several above $2 million. So apartments are a lot more affordable. And it's noticeable looking at the annual price trends in this area, that while many of the house markets, the suburbs, median prices are down in double digits in annual terms, the apartment markets have held up a lot better. There's been some decline in many of them, but only sort of 4 or 5% in many cases. And one or two have actually had growth in their median prices in the last 12 months. And a noticeable feature is that some of those where the median prices are down in annual terms, in the last quarter, there's been that decline has stopped. And so it's another indication that prices are turning around in Sydney generally, but particularly in this precinct. Yields by Sydney standards are not bad. Many of the suburbs with the unit markets in the Northern Beaches precinct have median rental yields sort of close to 4%, which is pretty good by Sydney standards. Pays to keep an eye on vacancy rates. There's quite a variance right throughout the Northern Beaches area. Some suburbs, like the one I mentioned earlier, DY, that postcode 1.5%, also the North Narrabeen postcode 1.5%, and others with vacancy rates 2 to 2.5%. But there are a few that are well above average at the moment, largely because of unit development. I suspect Avalon Beach is above 7%, and Seaforth is close to that as well. So place to check them out when choosing part of the market you might want to invest in. Noticeable that while many of the suburbs of the Northern Beaches areas have median house prices still down quite a lot in annual terms, the one or two have defied that trend. Colliery's up actually 15%. Its median house price 2.75 million after a rise of 15% in the last 12 months, and Seaforth is up 3% with its median price in the last 12 months. So there has been some resistance, as I said earlier, to the downturn in this area, and now we're seeing it as one of the leaders of Sydney's fight back. So that's one of the inclusions in our new top 5 Sydney Hotspots report, which is part of the spring special bundle, the best of Sydney and the best of Melbourne. And turning to the Melbourne market, which is also showing good signs of recovery, very, very similar, high activity and good competition for good properties, of which there are relatively few at the moment still, even though our listings have picked up a little bit in the last week or so. And an area that stands out for us amongst others is the Darebin local government area, the northern suburbs of Melbourne, approximately 10 to 15 kilometres north of Melbourne. We're talking about suburbs like Coburg, Bundoora, Northcote, Preston, etc. It's an evolving precinct, one that has perhaps been considered a little down market, or they're not particularly sought of in the past, but it's become very trendy, and it's got a strong ethnic flavour, lots of colour and diversity, and it's become very much sought after, and we've seen prices rise strongly, and we've seen some pretty good resistance to the recent Melbourne downturn. If you look at pricing across the precinct, in terms of the housing markets, one or two have dropped their median prices by 10 or 12%, but that's actually the exception. Most suburbs with their median house prices are down only 1 or 2 or 3%. Some are 4 or 5%, but relatively muted decline. And then all the suburbs with significant apartment markets, they haven't dropped at all. In fact, they're all still up 2 or 3% compared to 12 months ago. So this market has been very resistant to the downturn that we've seen in Melbourne's market over the last 18 months prior to the very recent turnaround. So this has been a good market, and what we like about it is the infrastructure that's there, and the strong presence of education and the medical precinct around La Trobe University. The La Trobe University precinct is made up of the university itself, the La Trobe University Medical Centre, and also a private hospital. So it's always great to have a market with something like that in its midst. We often see a clustering of big medical facilities, hospitals, private hospitals with universities, and where you have that, you have a very major employment node, and it generates very, very strong demand for rentals from students, nurses, people who are working in these facilities or attending them as students, and that makes for a strong rental market. And when you look at the vacancy rates right throughout this local government area in the north of Melbourne, we see that every postcode has a vacancy rate no higher than 2.2%, and most of them are well below 2%. The Thornbury postcode's below 1%. Several of them are just marginally above 1%. So very tight rental market. And when you've got a very tight rental market, rents rise, and when rents rise, prices have a tendency to follow. So we do have a strong expectation that we're going to see a return to pretty good price growth in this area. Relatively affordable, particularly in the apartment markets. Most of the suburbs have median house prices of above 700,000, some are in the 800,000s. And units compare very favourably. We've got 3 or 4 suburbs with median unit prices in the 400,000, others in the 500,000, a few a little higher. But by Melbourne standards, very good level of affordability. As I said, pricing has not dropped in this area in the last 12 months, contrary to the general trend in the Melbourne market. I'm referring there to the suburbs with unit markets, much more resistant to the downturn than houses. Rental returns pretty good. A number of suburbs have median rental yields for apartments from somewhere between 4.5% to 5% by Melbourne standards. That's pretty good. So a market that's getting a lot of demand, a good level of affordability in the apartment market, very low vacancy, strong rental market. Prices have held up strongly against the downturn, and we just think going forward this is a market that's going to get good demand and show good price growth. So that's the Darebin local government area in the northern suburbs of Melbourne. So 2 examples of what's included in the spring special bundle, the best of Sydney, best of Melbourne, 2 reports for the price of 1, top 5 Sydney hotspots, top 5 Melbourne hotspots. So check it out on the hotspotting.com.au website. That's it for now. Let's talk again soon.